I'm Gwen Rees and I'm from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. I wanted to talk to everyone today a little bit about some of the work that's gone into my PhD, which is looking at understanding veterinary medicine use on UK farms. The stuff I wanted to talk about this afternoon was the qualitative research that we've done. I've called it "It's cheaper than a dead cow" just because that's what one of my farmers said when I asked him why he was using an antibiotic at a certain time. And I think that really probably reflects, for a lot of you, the sort of reasons sometimes why farmers use antibiotics or why we use antibiotics as vets. So the reason that we decided to do this research was that we knew that there was really not very good data on the way that medicines are being used on UK dairy farms, or even on measuring how much is being used. So at the moment, the government is using sort of national level sales data. They have moved a little bit towards using veterinary sales data to estimate the quantity of antimicrobials being used on UK dairy farms. But that doesn't really give us much of a picture of what's happening on an individual farm. Knowing what's being sold in the United Kingdom is useful, but not when we want to understand farmer behaviour. It's already been identified that we've got a really poor understanding of how decisions are being made about medicine use on farm. I think that's really important because, like in a lot of countries in the UK, veterinary surgeons will prescribe a veterinary medicine, so prescribe an antimicrobial to a farm. That antimicrobial is then often stored on that farm for use at a later date at that farmer's discretion, which means that the vast majority of antimicrobial treatments are happening in the absence of the prescribing vet. We don't really know what's happening when we're not on the farm, and I got really interested in this topic, and yeah, it's an area with an overwhelming need for further research, so we thought we'd look into it. So the research aims of this part of my PhD were to investigate attitudes, beliefs and values of dairy farmers about medicine use, medicine storage, medicine recording. So what do they think about the way that they're making treatments and the way they're getting information? But we already know there's a big difference between what we think and what we intend to do and what we actually do in real life. So combined with this, we wanted to study what was actually happening on farms. So looking at the culture on that farm and the practices and behaviours of those farmers. So not really just asking them what they're doing. So I'm from the United Kingdom. That circle has moved. The farms weren't in the sea. Sorry, this is when I've made the study widescreen, made the PowerPoint widescreen. But based at the University of Bristol, the study farms were based in the southwest of England and South Wales, which are both quite dairy-intense areas of the UK. As part of the wider study, we had 27 dairy farms recruited. Of these 27, 20 farmers were interviewed using semi-structured, in-depth interview techniques, and 3 farms were selected for in-depth, year-long participant observation. So that first research aim, looking at investigating attitudes, beliefs and values, like I say, we conducted 20 semi-structured, in-depth interviews. These were conducted with the main decision maker on each dairy farm as identified by that person. They happened face-to-face, they happened on the dairy farm, they were all conducted by myself. The mean interview length was 50 minutes, but it ranged from about 30 minutes to 90. So these are really quite in-depth interviews, and they're called semi-structured because you don't just turn up with a long list of questions and ask them. You turn up with a bit of a topic guide, so I knew I wanted to talk about medicine storage, use and recording. You start with a few open questions, and from then on it kind of goes where the farmer wants it to go, which means that you can really get data that you could never get if you went in with predetermined questions, because if you go in with predetermined questions, the only answers you're going to get are the answers to those questions. So if you don't know to ask the question, you'll never know the answer. So it's more listening to what the farmer wants to talk about when talking about these topics. The other research methodology, some of you may have heard of, but it's quite new to the veterinary world really, is ethnographic methodology. This was to study the on-farm context and cultures about these behaviours with medicine use and treatment decisions. This is a methodology that's really got its origins in anthropology. So anthropology has its origins in studying cultures that we didn't understand. So someone would go and live with a tribe for a year and learn the language and just sort of describe everything about that tribe. And I guess for me, the tribe was UK dairy farmers. So I had 3 farms which were purposefully sampled to represent one small family farm, one medium-sized sort of normal farm for the UK, and one large dairy farm. I then spent a year visiting each of the 3 farms around once a month for about 6 to 8 hours each visit. And it's called participant observation because you observe and you write field notes as you go, so you're watching the day-to-day activities on these farms. As most of you know, any farm that's got a decent number of cows is going to have treatment decisions happening every day. But you're also participating. So I was going and I was helping with milking, I was helping to feed the calves, and you do that for a year, people can't really change their behaviour in your presence for that length of time. You become part of that farm. So I managed to gather about 160 hours of field note data from this methodology as well. And I just want to talk really quickly, a bit of a run through of 5 of the sort of themes that have come out, because I've analysed both of these 2 data sets together and really inductively looked at some of the themes that are coming out and what kind of effect they may have when it comes to medicine use and specifically antimicrobial use, because really that's what we're most interested in. So one of the key themes or things that are important to farmers and that affects their medicine use is their knowledge. They gain their own knowledge, and they gain this primarily in what we call an experiential or an experimental way. So what I mean by that is experiential, they learn by experience. If they use an antibiotic to treat a disease and it works, they will always use that antibiotic to treat that disease because in their minds they know that that antibiotic works on their cows, on their farm, in their cows. Experimental knowledge, this may resonate with some of you, but a lot of farmers who have a different range of antibiotics on the farm will, without the vet necessarily knowing, try out a few different ones and see which works best. So they're conducting their own sort of scientific experiments on farm and developing their own knowledge about medicine use. And that then develops their understanding of disease. And a farmer's understanding of disease, it turns out, is very different from a veterinary surgeon's sort of more scientific, maybe, understanding of disease. And I think this might be where we get a lot of communication breakdown, is that we have 2 different ways of looking at the same thing. And then vets assume that farmers are doing one thing, farmers assume vets are doing another. Farmers are also really acutely aware that they have a lack of knowledge about medicines and about disease diagnosis. This leads to uncertainty, and there's a huge literature in human medicine that uncertainty drives risk-averse antimicrobial use, which drives irresponsible antimicrobial use. So using something just in case because it's cheaper than a dead cow. This is one of the quotes. I think medicine, the problem is there's no knowledge. I've seen my dad in the medicine cupboard literally picking up different bottles of antibiotic and thinking, which one today? You can go to agricultural college or university, but they don't teach you a thing about medicines. Another thing that came across quite strongly was the farmer's sense of identity. That really can have an effect on how that farmer behaves when it comes to medicine use and when it comes to treating their animals. So farmers have a very strong sense of their own identity and of the identity of being a good farmer. They also have a really strong identity at the farm level. So they believe that their farm is unique and different to next door's farm, to a farm up in Scotland, to a farm on the other side of the world. And I think that has a really big impact when it comes to herd health planning and when it comes to uptake of advice. If they think the advice is generic, they're not going to listen to it because it's not specific to their unique farm. They also see themselves as ambassadors for animal welfare, so they're really aware of public perception of the animal welfare on their farms. But they think it's really important that this identity is acknowledged by vets, and as this quote shows, these experts can tell you how it should be until they're blue in the face. They've never been there in the milking pit day in, day out, struggling with chilblains and debt and cows kicking and staff calling in sick and everything else we have going on. Sometimes reality is very different. So I think that kind of expresses a bit of a frustration, maybe, that people don't understand the contexts on farm. Trust, unsurprisingly, comes up a lot whenever we look into these things. And in this study, it really showed that conditional trust, so trust that can be earned and can be lost, was developed with the vet, so the vet to give the right advice, with their staff to carry out the treatments properly, trust in their animals to actually get better, that was quite important, and trust in the medicine to work, and then the data, so they really need to be able to trust data before they'll use it, otherwise they see no value in having any data at all. So this probably will resonate with all the vets in the room, but farmers are pretty typical. They have their favourite vet on farm, and it's always guilty until proven innocent. That new vet's bloody useless, rah, rah, rah. Then they turn up one morning and save a cow, and all of a sudden they're the best thing ever. So it just goes to show that, you know, the tides can change in all of those trust relationships. So I called this one Autonomy, and it was about a sort of sense of perceived control. Is a farmer actually able to make the decisions, or do they feel restricted? Turns out that they feel restricted most of the time. External forces often restrict treatment decisions, be that national disease control programs in the UK, culling from TB, tuberculosis diagnosis is quite high on some farms, which leaves voluntary culling as a second best, which means they can't cull due to disease a lot of the time, which means they have to use treatments instead. There's quite a hierarchy on farms, I'm sure everybody knows, even if it's a small family farm which has got a son, a dad and a granddad, or if it's a big farm which has got an owner, a manager and staff. There's a bit of a battle of power about who's making the decisions and who's right and who's wrong. If the physical resources are really important, if you haven't got a good shed to keep your calves in, you're going to rely on antibiotics instead, or you're also going to only be able to use what you stock in your cupboard. Unless you fancy driving out to the vet practice or calling the vet out, those physical resources have a real sort of restriction on what the farmer can do. Also turns out that protocols reduce autonomy, but they also reduce uncertainty, so they're not a bad thing. So come to think of it in terms of how to choose which antibiotic to use in a case of mastitis, the short answer is it depends whether it's first case, whether it's repeat, and whether we've got it in stock. The last theme then is, I think, quite an important one to come out, but it came out very strongly. Farmers have a really keen sense of a duty of care to their animals. And as vets, we have this sense, but it's important to recognise that farmers also have this. They see themselves as responsible. A lot of the time they're treating animals because it's distressing to see a sick cow. Giving an antibiotic is something that they can do about it. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is almost irrelevant to them. It's seen as positive action, so we need to give them other positive actions to do, perhaps. Obviously, I'd love a day without having to treat sick animals. A lot of people would. The thing I hate is the sick cows, having to tube cows. That's when you feel like a failure. But then this guy's trying to compare it to 250 people. A couple of them would be going to the doctors. So in conclusion, that was a really quick rattle through, but I think I'm running out of time. We, the vets, need to provide knowledge. Farmers want it. They want to know more about how to use medicines, how to diagnose disease, and we're the people who should be doing that. We need to deal with uncertainty. We need to develop farm-specific treatment protocols in collaboration with our farmers. These protocols that go up on the wall, reduce uncertainty, and improve responsible prescribing. Dealing with trust, we just need to spend time building that relationship. I know that's easier said than done, and it's probably stating the bleeding obvious, that one. And yeah, I think from what I found, really using a participatory approach, when we're designing policy, we've got to understand what the farmers' needs are before we can begin to make any real changes. Anyway, thank you very much. That's my talk, and I'll take any questions.